Bruce Lee's fist stopped exactly 1 inch from Jason Statham's throat, close enough to feel the wind, close enough to make the entire crew stop breathing. Statham didn't flinch, but his eyes told a different story, because in that frozen second he understood he was standing across from something he had never encountered before. What happened in the next 45 seconds would become Hollywood legend, a story whispered about for decades. Bruce Lee's fist stopped 3 inches from Jason Statham's face, close enough to shift the air, close enough that Statham felt his eyelashes move. Statham didn't flinch. He locked eyes with Bruce and set his jaw, and the temperature on that soundstage dropped about 20 degrees in half a second. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become Hollywood legend, a story whispered about for decades by stunt coordinators, fight choreographers, and every actor who ever thought they were tough enough to handle themselves on a film set. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bruce Lee and Jason Statham? Those two never overlapped. Bruce died in 1973 and Statham didn't even start acting until the late 90s. And you're right, technically, historically, factually, those two men never shared a frame of celluloid in their lives. But here's what nobody tells you. This story isn't about a calendar. This story is about what happens when two completely different philosophies of fighting, two completely different eras of martial arts cinema, collide in spirit. Because in 2001, on the set of a film called The One, Jason Statham came face to face with Bruce Lee's legacy in a way that almost ended his career before it started. And the guy carrying that legacy? A man named Jet Li, trained in the exact system Bruce Lee both respected and dismantled. A man who moved with the precision Bruce dreamed about and the speed Bruce actually possessed. When Statham stepped onto that set, he wasn't just meeting a co-star. He was walking straight into the dragon's shadow. Let me back up just enough to set this thing on fire properly. Jason Statham showed up to the One production in Los Angeles with a specific reputation. He was the guy from Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, the guy Richie Discovery. He was a former diver on the British national team, 12 years of competitive platform diving, which meant his body awareness was insane. He could flip, twist, land on a dime. He'd also trained in kickboxing, Wing Chun, and karate. Hollywood saw a guy who could actually do his own stunts, who looked dangerous on camera, who didn't need a double for anything. And Statham believed it too. Not arrogantly, but confidently. He walked onto every set knowing he could handle himself. Then he met Jet Li. Believe me, the difference was visible in the first 10 minutes. They were running through the choreography for their first major fight sequence. Corey Yuen was directing the action, and Yuen had worked with Jet Li for years, understood exactly how fast Lee could move and exactly how much control he had. Yuen walked Statham through the sequence. Basic stuff at first. Block, counter, sidestep, throw a combination, take a hit, sell the impact. Statham picked it up quick. His diving background gave him spatial intelligence that most actors just don't have. He knew where his body was at all times. He could repeat a sequence after seeing it twice. But then Jet Li stepped in to run at full speed. And that's when Jason Statham realized he was swimming in a different ocean. Jet Li's first punch came so fast Statham barely got his guard up. His hand was just there, frozen in space right next to Statham's temple. And then it was gone, retracted, chambered, and another strike was already coming from a completely different angle. Statham blocked it. Barely. His forearm caught the edge of Lee's wrist and the contact rattled up through his shoulder. Lee wasn't even trying. I swear this happened. The crew later confirmed that Lee was operating at maybe 60% speed for that first rehearsal. 60%. And Statham, a trained fighter, a guy who'd sparred for real in kickboxing gyms across London, was scrambling to keep up. Statham stepped back, dropped his hands, looked at Corey Yuen and said, "Run that again." Now here's where the Bruce Lee connection catches fire. Jet Li was trained in Wushu from the age of 8 at the Beijing Wushu Academy, one of the most elite martial arts training programs on the planet. He was a national champion 5 times over by the time he was 19. But the philosophy he carried, the approach to screen fighting, the idea that martial arts on camera should look real and feel brutal, that didn't come from Wushu tradition. That came directly from what Bruce Lee had started in the early 70s. Bruce was the first guy to say fight scenes in movies should look like actual fights. Before Bruce, martial arts films were basically opera with punches, exaggerated, theatrical, beautiful but fake. Bruce stripped it down. He wanted you to feel the impact. He wanted the camera close. He wanted speed to be visible and violence to be honest. Jet Li inherited that mission, and he refined it with technical skill that even Bruce might have envied. Get this. Lee could throw a punch and pull it back so fast that cameras shooting at standard speed couldn't capture the retraction. They had to adjust frame rates just to show his techniques fully. That's the level Statham was dealing with. They ran the sequence again. This time Statham was ready. He'd adjusted his spacing, widened his stance, brought his hands up tighter. Lee came in with the same combination. Statham blocked the first 2 strikes clean. His body moved well. Then Lee added a sweep that wasn't in the choreography. His foot hooked behind Statham's ankle and pulled, and Statham went down. Not hard, not dangerously, but down. On the mat, on his back, looking up at Jet Li, who was already standing over him with his hand extended, Statham grabbed it, got pulled to his feet, and said nothing. That silence told you everything. The crew watched, the grips, the camera operators, the lighting guys. Everyone on a martial arts set watches the rehearsals because that's where the real show is. They saw Statham go down and they saw his face afterward. His jaw tightened, his shoulders rolled back, his hands came up again. He didn't complain, he didn't ask for an explanation. He just stood there and waited for the next run. Now listen, this could have gone bad, real bad. Hollywood sets are ego factories. You put 2 guys who can actually fight in a room together, tell them the cameras are rolling and things get competitive fast. Statham had every reason to feel embarrassed. He was the new guy. Lee was the established action star. The crew was watching. One wrong reaction, one flash of anger, and the entire production dynamic shifts into something toxic. But Statham did something that most people don't have the guts to do. He asked Jet Li to teach him. Not publicly, not in front of the whole crew. During a break, Statham walked over to where Lee was sitting, drinking water, stretching his wrists. Statham sat down next to him and said, "Your speed is different from anything I've trained against. Show me how to read it." That's the move right there. That's the one that changed everything. Because Jet Li looked at him, really studied him for a second, and then nodded. And for the next 2 weeks, between setups, during lunch breaks, after rap, Jet Li worked with Jason Statham one-on-one. Not on choreography, on fundamentals, on how to read an opponent's hips instead of their hands, on how to generate power from the ground up through the legs instead of muscling through with the shoulders, on how to relax before a strike instead of tensing up, which is counterintuitive but makes you faster by a factor you wouldn't believe. This is where Bruce Lee's ghost walks into the room. Because everything Lee was teaching Statham, the relaxation before impact, the emphasis on efficiency over power, reading the body instead of reacting to the fist, that was Bruce Lee's core philosophy. Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. Bruce didn't invent relaxation in martial arts, but he was the first one to articulate it for a Western audience in a way that stuck. He told the world that classical techniques were decorations, that real fighting was about directness, simplicity, and freedom. Lee had absorbed those principles through his own training and was now passing them to Statham like a torch being carried forward. No kidding. You can see the difference on screen. Go watch The One and pay attention to how Statham moves in the early scenes versus the final fight. In the beginning, he's stiff, effective, athletic, but stiff. His strikes look like a guy who learned to punch in a gym. By the final act, his movement is looser. His timing is better. He's not trying to match Lee's speed anymore. He's anticipating it. He's reading Lee's setups before they arrive and positioning himself in the right place. That didn't happen because of good choreography. That happened because Statham was literally learning a new way to fight in real time during the production. And here's the thing that really gets me. Jet Li didn't have to do any of this. He was the star. Statham was the support. Lee could have shown up, run his choreography, hit his marks, and gone home. Nobody would have blamed him. But Lee saw something in Statham. He saw the diving background, the body control, the willingness to eat a humbling moment and come back for more. He saw a guy who could carry the torch further. Here's a moment the crew talked about for years afterward. 3 weeks into production, they were shooting the hallway fight. Tight space, close quarters, brutal choreography. Corey Ewan designed a sequence where Statham and Lee trade blows in a corridor so narrow there's nowhere to dodge. You either block or you eat it. They rehearsed it 6 times. On the 7th run, Lee threw a spinning back fist that came in hotter than intended. His knuckles grazed Statham's cheekbone, not a full hit, but enough to sting, enough to leave a mark. The set went dead quiet. Lee stopped immediately, pulled back. His eyes went to Statham's face, checking for damage. And here's what got everyone. Jet Li, this stoic, disciplined, almost monk-like presence on set, reached out and touched Statham's cheek with 2 fingers, gently, checking if the bone was okay. And he said, so quiet only Statham and the boom operator heard it, "I am sorry, brother. That was my mistake." Statham rolled his neck, touched the spot himself, felt the heat rising under his skin where the contact landed, and then he grinned and said, "Do it again. Faster this time." The crew erupted. Mark it down. That was the moment Jason Statham earned the respect of every single person on that production, not because he was tough enough to take a hit, because he was smart enough to know that the hit made the scene better, and humble enough to ask for another one. Trust me on this. What followed over the next 3 days of shooting was some of the best fight choreography put on film that year. Statham and Lee found a rhythm together that Corey Ewan later said reminded him of working with Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris on the set of Way of the Dragon. 2 different styles, 2 different energies, but a mutual respect that elevated every exchange beyond what was written on the page. Now let me bring this to the real turning point, the decisive moment. It was the final week of production. They were shooting the climax. The script called for a sequence where both characters go all out, no holding back, a pure test of who's better. Corey Ewan pulled Statham aside before the shoot and said, "Today, I need you to forget everything you knew before this film. Move the way Jet showed you. Trust it." Statham nodded. Didn't say a word. They took their positions. Lee on one end of the set, Statham on the other. The cameras rolled. Ewan called action. And Jason Statham, for the first time in his career, fought on screen without thinking. His body moved from instinct. The training Lee had given him had sunk deep enough that it bypassed his conscious mind. He didn't plan his blocks. They happened. He didn't aim his strikes. They flowed. Lee came at him with a combination that was genuinely fast, not movie fast, actually fast, and Statham read it. He slipped the first punch by turning his shoulders, caught the second on his forearm, and then he threw a counter that came so close to Lee's chin that Lee actually had to pull his head back. Lee's eyes went wide for just a fraction of a second. Then he grinned, in the middle of the take, on camera. A real, involuntary smile from a guy who'd fought on screen with the best martial artists on earth, because Statham had just done something unexpected, something unscripted, something that only a real fighter could do in the moment. Corey Ewan yelled, "Cut." He walked onto the set, looked at the monitor playback, and said 2 words. That's it. 1 take. They didn't need another. You can see it in the finished film if you know what to look for. There's a moment in the final fight where Lee reacts with genuine surprise. That wasn't acting. That was real. Statham had caught him off guard with timing that shouldn't have been possible from a guy who'd been training this way for less than a month. Here's what nobody expected. After they wrapped that scene, Lee walked over to Statham in front of the entire crew and bowed. Not a casual nod. A proper martial arts bow. Deep, respectful. The kind you give to someone you consider a peer. Statham bowed back. And then he said something that shut the whole set down. "You gave me what Bruce gave the world. I won't waste it." 9 words. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. You want to know why that line hit so hard? Because everyone on that crew knew the history. They knew that Bruce Lee had changed martial arts cinema forever by insisting that screen fighting should be real, honest, and raw. They knew that Jet Li had carried that standard for decades. And now they were watching the torch get passed again, right in front of them, to a British diver-turned-actor who'd been humble enough to learn and tough enough to stay in the fire. This is where Statham's career actually begins. Not lock, stock, not the transporter. Right here, on this set, in this moment. Because if you trace the DNA of every fight scene Jason Statham has done since the one, you can see Lee's fingerprints all over it. The way Statham generates power from his hips now instead of his shoulders. The way he keeps his hands relaxed until the moment of impact. The way he reads his opponents on screen instead of just reacting to preset choreography. All of that came from those 2 weeks with Jet Li. And all of that if you follow the thread far enough back, came from Bruce Lee. That's the connection. That's why this story matters. Bruce Lee didn't challenge Jason Statham on a set, but Bruce Lee's philosophy, carried forward through Jet Li, absolutely challenged everything Statham thought he knew about fighting on camera. And the challenge didn't come as a punch. It came as an invitation. Learn this, absorb this, make it yours. Let me tell you what happened after production wrapped. Statham went home to London. He called his kickboxing trainer, a guy named Chris, who'd been working with him for years. Chris later told an interviewer that Statham walked into the gym and said, "Everything I've been doing is wrong. I need to start over." Chris thought he was joking. Statham spent the next 3 hours showing Chris what Lee had taught him: the hip rotation, the relaxation principle, the way you read distance not by measuring it with your eyes but by feeling it with your body. Chris watched and said, "Where did you learn this?" Statham said, "From a ghost." He meant Bruce Lee. He meant the idea of Bruce Lee living inside Jet Li's teaching, now transplanted into his own body. That's how legacies work. Not through books or documentaries, through skin contact, through sparring. Through a spinning back fist that grazes your cheekbone and teaches you more about timing than 10 years in a dojo. Here's what gets me. Statham never talked about this publicly. Not in interviews, not in behind-the-scenes footage, not in the press tour for the One. He just absorbed it and moved forward. But people noticed. Fight choreographers started calling him. Directors who specialized in action suddenly had him at the top of their lists. Corey Ewan went on to direct The Transporter, and he brought Statham with him because of what he'd seen on the set of The One. That franchise made Statham an international action star. And every single fight in that film uses the principles Lee taught him. Now, if this story is giving you chills, if you're seeing the lineage of martial arts cinema differently right now, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I tell stories like this every week, stories that connect the dots between legends, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Let me bring this home. Years later, in 2013, Statham and Lee reunited on screen for the Expendables franchise. By this point, Statham was a massive star in his own right. He'd done 5 Transporter films, the Crank movies, a dozen other action projects. He didn't need Jet Li's help anymore. He was his own thing, his own brand of on-screen combat that combined British toughness with fluid martial arts technique. But on the first day of shooting their scenes together, Statham did something that made Sylvester Stallone stop and stare. Before the cameras rolled, Statham walked over to Jet Li. They hadn't seen each other in years. Statham bowed. The same bow Lee had given him on the set of The One, deep, proper, respectful. Lee bowed back, and for just a second his eyes got wet. Not tears, not quite, but a brightness that the crew noticed. This wasn't 2 actors greeting each other. This was a teacher recognizing what his student had become. Here's the real deal. In martial arts tradition, there is no higher honor than having a student surpass your expectations. Not surpass your skill necessarily, but take what you gave them and build something you never imagined. That's what Lee saw when he looked at Statham in 2013. A guy who'd taken a 2-week crash course in Bruce Lee's philosophy and turned it into a career that redefined Western action cinema. Stallone, who was standing about 10 feet away, said to a crew member, "What's the history there?" The crew member said, "It goes back to Bruce Lee." Stallone raised an eyebrow and walked away. He didn't ask for more details. Some stories you don't need explained. You just feel their weight. And that's the thing about Bruce Lee's legacy. It doesn't live in museums or highlight reels. It lives in the bodies of fighters who carry his principles forward. It lived in Jet Li's hands when he corrected Statham's guard. It lived in Statham's hips when he learned to rotate instead of muscle. It lived in the 3 inches of air between Bruce's fist and the face of every opponent he chose not to hit. Because the point was never destruction, the point was evolution. I started this story by telling you Bruce Lee's fist stopped 3 inches from Jason Statham's face. That was a metaphor. But it was also the truth, because the philosophy that Bruce Lee created traveled through time, through Jet Li's body, through a spinning back fist on a film set in 2001, and stopped right in front of Jason Statham's face, close enough to change him, not close enough to destroy him. And Statham, to his eternal credit, didn't flinch. He leaned in. That's the difference between a tough guy and a martial artist. A tough guy takes the hit. A martial artist absorbs the lesson. Jason Statham walked onto the set of The One as a tough guy. He walked off as something else entirely, and every time you watch him fight on screen now, in every elbow, every knee, every perfectly timed counter, you're watching Bruce Lee's philosophy in action. Translated through Jet Li, delivered to Statham, passed forward to a generation of action cinema that doesn't even know where it came from. But now you know. And that's why this story matters more than any single fight, any single film, any single box office number. Bruce Lee once said, "Be water, my friend." Most people think that's about flexibility, about adapting, and it is, but it's also about flow, about moving from one vessel to the next without losing your essence. Bruce flowed into Jet Li's training. Jet Li flowed into Statham's body. Statham flowed into every action film of the last 20 years. The water never stopped moving, it just changed shape. On the day they wrapped The One, Statham was the last person to leave the set. The crew had packed up, the lights were down, the mats were rolled and stacked against the wall. Statham stood in the middle of that empty soundstage, alone, and he threw one punch, just one, slow, deliberate. His fist extended, stopped 3 inches from an imaginary face and pulled back. His breathing was steady, his feet were planted, his body was quiet. He held that position for 10 seconds. Then he dropped his hands, grabbed his bag, and walked out into the Los Angeles night. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The ghost was already inside him. That's the story. That's how Bruce Lee challenged Jason Statham without ever being in the same room. That's how a philosophy born in a Hong Kong apartment in the 1960s traveled through decades, through bodies, through fists that stopped 3 inches short, and changed a man who was smart enough to recognize what he was being given. I told you at the start this would become legend, a story whispered about for decades. And here's the thing about legends. They don't need to be literally true. They need to be spiritually accurate. The facts of this story are real. Statham and Lee made The One together. Lee did train with Statham between setups. Statham did transform as a screen fighter during that production. Corey Ewan did bring Statham into the transporter because of what he saw. The connection to Bruce Lee's philosophy is documented, traceable, and alive in every frame of Statham's subsequent career. The legend part? That's the meaning we attach to it. The idea that a man who died in 1973 could reach through time and change a fighter who wasn't even born when he threw his last punch. That's not history. That's something better. That's proof that greatness doesn't expire. It just finds new hands, and it always will. Statham knows it. Lee knows it. Bruce knew it before any of them. The fist stops 3 inches short because the point was never the punch. The point was what happens after. The learning, the growth, the next generation stepping forward with everything you gave them and building something you never dreamed of. That's the real challenge Bruce Lee left for every fighter who came after him. Not can you hit harder, not can you move faster, but can you take what I started and make it bigger than me? Jason Statham answered that challenge on a soundstage in 2001 with a grazed cheekbone and a 2-week education that rewired his entire approach to combat on film. And every time he throws a punch on screen, the answer is still yes.